Would you trust someone who dies whispering, "If I tell, they'll die too"? It was dawn. Cold light. Cell 17 had been silent for hours, until that sound. A barely audible whisper pierced the halls of Black Hollow's maximum security prison, words that chilled even the most seasoned prison guard. Mark Elridge, convicted of 3 brutal murders, sat staring at the wall. He didn't scream. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't say goodbye. He just said that. An enigmatic phrase, almost begging to be ignored but impossible to forget. If I tell, they'll die too. 47 minutes later, he was dead. No cameras in the hallway. No reliable witnesses. No official explanation. And the most disturbing, no autopsy was authorized. The medical report disappeared from the files. The coroner disappeared days later. Literally. Never seen again. Have you seen this pattern before? Elridge wasn't just a killer. At least, not an ordinary one. He knew something big, something that, if it came to light, could lead to more bodies, or worse, unearthing names that should never be made public. Judges, priests, executives. And then, the question that echoes to this day: who are they? They. Have you ever felt like you were watching a puzzle where all the pieces seem wrong? Until a truth emerges and makes everything you thought you knew crumble in seconds? That's what this story does. It doesn't comfort. It doesn't close cycles. It opens wounds. Mark's history reveals a forgotten past, a childhood marked by forced silence, an orphanage destroyed by a strange fire, and a series of disappearances that were never fully investigated. Whenever he was pressed by investigators, his answer was the same. There are things that, if I tell you, I can't undo. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you. There are recordings that have never been shown, documents sealed by court order, a pattern that has been repeated for decades but that has always been buried, sometimes literally. People involved in this case died in bizarre circumstances. One of them left a single sentence before disappearing. It wasn't madness, it was survival. Have you ever been there? Feeling that someone knows more than they are saying? And that their silence is not cowardice but real fear? The fear of an invisible, untouchable, and fatal system? Why did Mark choose to die? With the secret? Why did he ask in his last request before his execution that his cell not be touched for 72 hours? And what was more? What was hidden behind the torn Bible that was given to the chaplain? Hours before the chaplain also disappeared, the last recording made with Mark Elridge was censored for more than 10 years. But today, part of it has leaked, and what it reveals is unacceptable. From here on, the truth will not spare you, because what lies behind these whispered words still breathes in the shadows. What disturbed you most about this story? The idea that a secret can kill, or the silence that destroys even those who dare to listen? If something is left hammering away inside you, write it down. Maybe what bothered you with a piece that nobody noticed. It is in this crack, in this restlessness, that the truth begins to leak out. Your voice here is not only welcome, it is necessary, because only when one person's pain meets the watchful gaze of another is that the hidden begins to crumble. If this video touched you in any way, if at any point you stopped and thought, "This can't go on like this," it's not about ego. It is for memory preservation, for giving space to what they are trying to erase. Your gesture keeps this investigation alive, and make this story reach those who need to hear it most. And if you feel like you belong in this kind of quest, that this dark journey has something to do with what you also carry, then it stays. Here, whoever signs up doesn't shy away from discomfort. Compare. Tear the veil. Help break this pact of silence that still protects monsters. What comes now is not entertainment. It's revelation. And as Mark whispered in the freezing cell, they think silence is safe. But when someone starts listening, everything falls apart. The truth will come out, and you'll be here when it happens. Mark Elridge was not just another name erased from prison records. He was a man marked by wounds that no one dared to delve deeply into. He was born in a gray town, Redwood, a place where silence carried the weight of a sentence and where the streets hid stories that no one wanted to tell. Since he was a boy, he carried an invisible burden, a trauma that tore at his soul before he even understood what the world was. The figure of his absent father, the muffled screams of his mother within the fragile walls of the house, the loneliness of an orphanage that burned in mysterious flames. All of this left marks that prison could never erase. When we look at Mark's criminal record, we see the surface of the abyss. 3 murders, shallow graves, bodies that never found rest. But what really haunted those who tried to understand his story were not the crimes themselves, but the words he repeated, almost like a tortured mantra. I just followed orders. If only it were just an excuse. But there was something behind it, something that shed light on a larger system, a game of power and fear that swallowed up anyone who dared to challenge its rules. Vices were his refuge and his punishment. Drugs, alcohol, a constant struggle to drown out the voice that whispered secrets too dangerous to reveal. The emptiness inside him was so deep that it seemed like a bottomless pit, where all hope died before it could be born. He was not a cold, calculating killer. He was a broken man, manipulated by invisible forces that pushed him to the edge of the precipice. That uncontrollable fear, that shadow that haunted him even within the prison walls, never had a face. It was never identified. There was never a name associated with the threat that made him silence forever. Mark's mind was a battlefield. Fragmented thoughts, memories that came back in painful flashbacks, faces that appeared and disappeared during sleepless nights. He knew too much. About crimes that no one should know about a code of silence that did not respect even justice itself. The murders were just the tip of the iceberg. What he carried was a hidden truth, a secret that could topple empires, destroy reputations, and cause a transformation so radical that few would have the courage to face it. This is where the real impact of this story comes in. Mark was not just a criminal. He was a piece on a much larger board, where the decisions made by others, invisible and powerful, shaped the fate of many. His journey was not just against the law, but against a system that devoured bodies and souls to keep its facade intact. And fear, that silent monster, was what brought him to the brink. A man trying to survive a battle that no one could win. The Redwood calling was not just where he grew up, but the symbol of a stolen childhood and a life marked by shadows. Every detail of his story reveals the behind-the-scenes of a tragic and complex existence, where the lines between victim and perpetrator blur. The truth about Mark Elridge is an invitation to look beyond the obvious, to question what we are told, to understand the layers that hide what really happened. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, revealing what these secrets mean beyond the 4 walls of the cell. Because the impact of this story goes beyond the chronicle of a convict. It touches on the mentality of a system that prefers silence, invisibility, and the manipulation of fear as a weapon to control lives and decisions. It is not just the journey of one man. It is the revelation of the dark mechanisms that define what we can know and what must remain buried forever. Making the difference between the hidden truth and the accepted lie, understanding the consequences of exposing these mysteries, is a step towards breaking the cycle. The transformation that this story can provoke depends on who is willing to listen to the whisper and face what comes with it. A brutal reality, full of doubts and twists that defy our understanding. Do you feel this too? This uneasiness that grows in your chest as if something big is about to emerge from the shadows? Comment. I'm on this journey too. It was on a muggy, moonless night that Mark Elridge asked to speak to the chaplain. That alone caught the guard's attention. He had never been interested in religion. He didn't read the Bible. He didn't attend prison services. He avoided any contact with the chaplain's wing. But that night, he asked, and he asked urgently. "It's about what comes next," he said, his voice low, his eyes deep. A heavy silence crept down the hallway as the chaplain walked toward cell 13. The meeting lasted 27 minutes. The guard on duty, Robert Haynes, never forgot the look on the chaplain's face as he left the cell. He was pale, as if he had seen something he shouldn't have. He walked straight past without saying a word and never returned that shift. 2 days later, he disappeared. Without a trace. No goodbye note, no footprints. His locker in the chapel was still locked. Inside, everything was in its place except the Bible. Mark's cell was searched the next morning. It was standard procedure whenever there was any unusual movement. And there, among the sacred pages, they found a folded piece of paper. A thin, yellowed piece of paper, hidden among the Psalms. Just one sentence written in shaky handwriting: "Do not disturb the place where it all began." It fell like acid in the prison's back rooms. None of the inmates knew about the note. None of the staff spoke publicly about the chaplain. But in Dublin, the hallways, the rumor grew like mold on a cold wall. What did Elridge say that night? What made a man disappear? And why was the note hidden in a Bible he supposedly never read? The answer begins much earlier. Before the murders, before the trials, before the name Elridge even appeared in the news. When he was still an invisible boy in a house that smelled of alcohol, fear, and stained walls. He was an only child. He grew up in a small town where closed windows kept secrets bigger than the world outside. His father? He disappeared for days. His mother? An apathetic figure, dragging her slippers around the house as if she were already dead inside. Mark learned early on to remain silent, to obey without understanding, to endure without asking. It was in this distorted childhood that he met thee. A man no one in town seemed to know, but who always showed up at the right or wrong moments. A neighbor who was never introduced, who had no home, but who sometimes appeared in the backyard. He said little, but when he did speak, Mark listened and obeyed. "You have to be strong," he said. "You have to learn not to feel." And with that came the trials. Little cruelties, tests, missions, until one day, the man disappeared, just like the chaplain, just like Mark's childhood. Decades later, sitting in his cell, Mark's gaze seemed stuck in the past. When asked about the crimes, he didn't hesitate. He described the locations, the instruments, the routes. But he always left gaps. He always evaded giving a complete answer. And he repeated, "I just followed orders." His tone was real, almost resigned, as if he were still under someone's command, someone who perhaps no longer existed, or worse, someone who never stopped existing. The chaplain's disappearance became a forbidden whisper within the prison. The cameras on that shift were mysteriously turned off. The entry and exit records disappeared, and the note was confiscated but never officially registered. One of the guards, the same one who searched the cell, swore that there was more. That Mark kept other papers, that the Bible was just the beginning, but he was never able to prove it. A few months later, he asked for a transfer. He said he couldn't sleep anymore. The question that no one had the courage to ask out loud was, what happens to who? Knows too much? Because since that night, Elridge has changed. He has walked less, eat less, talk less. But his eyes, those empty eyes, seemed more attentive than ever, watching everything, as if he was waiting for something, or someone. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because the chaplain wasn't the only one to disappear after getting close to Mark. An investigative reporter, a former detective on the case, even a woman who claimed to have known Mark as a child. They all disappeared, or died under strange circumstances. Coincidence? Or part of something much larger that was never revealed? Comment. I'm on this journey too, just so I know you're seeing what's behind it. They called it St. Elias Farm. A damp stone building, isolated among fields that seemed to go on forever. Passers-by said they heard sounds that didn't belong to any known animal. Whispers, short cries, moans of something alive or trapped. In 1995, it was an orphanage, the kind that seemed like charity but was hiding something else. Something rotten. The nuns didn't use names, only numbers. And Mark was 13, one of the youngest, one of the quietest, one of the ones who never cried. At the time, there were no digital records, only moldy papers stored in forgotten boxes. Many of them disappeared in the fire that no one really investigated. An explosion in the middle of the night. They called it an electrical accident, but there had been no electricity in that building since 1987. No one questioned it, no one cared. The orphanage closed the next day. Complete silence. The authorities erased the name from the list of religious institutions. But among the old residents of the area, the stories continued. Stories of children buried in shallow graves, of a basement locked with rusty boards, and of something that happened on nights of the new moon, always in the same place, the underground chapel. Mark never spoke about the farm. During all the interrogations, he avoided any mention of the past. But on the day of his conversation with the chaplain, he broke a rule. He spoke softly. He spoke with his eyes fixed on an invisible point on the cell wall. He said a sentence that the guard did not understand, but that stuck with him, word for word. "I remember the smell of burning wood. I remember the sound of digging earth." The chaplain just lowered his head, and 2 days later, he disappeared without a trace. It was during this interval that they found the note hidden inside Mark's Bible, folded with surgical precision between Revelation and Leviticus, written in red ink. "Don't touch the place where it all began." The cell was locked down. The cameras stopped working that night. The guard who found the note was transferred weeks later. No explanation. And the only clue left was in the word, place. For months, no one understood the reference, until an independent team decided to investigate Mark's past on their own. They dug through old documents. They spoke to forgotten locals. And the truth began to emerge through the cracks. Mark was 7 years old when he was taken to the Samuelias farm. His mother was missing. His father was unknown. His records were falsified. His name was changed. Before, his name was Daniel Vaz, a name that no one had ever associated with Mark, until that moment. And then came the most disturbing discovery. Daniel was officially declared dead during the fire. He was on the list of victims. His death certificate existed. Date: July 12, 1995, cause smoke asphyxiation. But his body was never found. From that point on, the narrative changes, and with it, the perception of what could have really happened. A boy everyone believed dead, an institution with rituals covered by faith, a timely fire, and someone who returns with a new name 20 years later, being accused of murders with strangely symbolic patterns. The coincidences are many, the questions inevitable. What happened on that farm? What did Mark see? Or worse, what did they do to him? Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because the supposed coincidence between Mark's past and the details of the crimes committed years later can no longer be ignored. The symbols left at the scenes, the words used in the notes, everything refers to distorted religious practices, fragments of psalms, references to the Lamb without a voice, phrases written in archaic Latin, and one in particular repeated 3 times in different places, and again the sacrifice, translation, and again the sacrifice. This pattern has led investigators to a dark hypothesis. The crimes were not random. They were recreations, as if Mark were trying to expose or repeat something he had experienced, a kind of inverted ritual, a silent code, as if to say, "Look what they did to me." But there is another possibility, even more so, and it begins with a name that appeared in the farm's forgotten records, Father Thomas Ferretti. Ferretti was the spiritual leader of the orphanage, a man with harsh words and eyes that never smiled. He disappeared 3 days before the fire. He was never found. Rumors said that he conducted ceremonies in the basement of the chapel, where only a few of the orphans had access. Always the same ones, always by force. And among those chosen few was Daniel. Based on these accounts, a new path in the investigation emerges. A path where Mark is not just guilty, nor just a victim, but a bridge, a link between two times, a man trying to rewrite his story with blood, or perhaps erase what was never said. The most disturbing thing is to realize that each crime committed carries a symbol of return, a kind of spiritual signature, as if he was not just killing, but invoking something. And here comes a detail that went unnoticed by investigators for a long time: the exact location of the last known crime, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of a small rural town. When asked why he had chosen that place, Mark responded coldly, "It was the only spot where the roots were still intact." The police thought he was delirious, but someone on the team recognized the landscape, the trees, the dirt road, and the slope behind the warehouse. It was the same area where the São Elias farm had been located in the 1990s. The orphanage had been demolished, yes, but the underground was still there, untouched, forgotten, sealed by old concrete and promises of eternal silence. Mark returned to the only place where he could still smell the original fear, where it all began. Apparently, he never really left. He just shed his skin and bided his time. Comment: This makes sense to me, because now, the next piece of this puzzle is what Mark left behind on purpose inside that chapel buried in time. 2 weeks before sentencing, Mark wrote one last letter, not to the press, not to his family, but to an unknown recipient whose initials appeared in blue ink on the envelope: JHC. The letter was never read in court. It was marked, "of no legal relevance." But it carried a much heavier sentence than the one the judge wrote on his letterhead. Inside it was a handwritten sentence in Latin: "The truth will destroy you. The truth will destroy you. Not set you free. Destroy you." Mark knew what he was talking about, because he wasn't just pointing to the crimes. He was pointing to the people who disappeared when the dust settled, the names that slipped through the dark corners of the system. Men with office, women with immunity, people who spent their lives center stage and then evaporated into the background. Joseph H. Carter was one of them, a businessman, a philanthropist, and a regular donor to the foundation that ran the former orphanage where Mark lived until he was 9. Documents show that Carter visited the place frequently, but after the fire, his name disappeared from the records. No note, no photo, no memento, as if he had never been there. But in the encrypted letter left by Mark, one of the few that escaped official seizure, it says, "He never left there. He just changed his name." That phrase is a code, a warning, a scream trapped in layers, and when it was cross-referenced with records of donations, property transfers, and identity changes after 1996, a pattern began to emerge. It wasn't just Carter. 5 other names Mark had mentioned in his interrogations. All of them ignored at the hearing were also missing, literally. 3 died in accidents described as unexplained. 1 disappeared off the map. The last was found dead, unidentified, his face unrecognizable, his fingerprints burned off. None of this was shown to the jury, because the prosecutor shut down any attempt to connect Mark's past. Any mention of the orphanage, the farm, the rituals, the missing witnesses, irrelevant, he said, as if the truth were a piece of clothing you choose when it suits you. The judge wouldn't allow any questions. Every time someone tried to dig too deep, the gavel would bang. Silence. Order. Censorship disguised as protocol. But behind the formalities there was panic. Because if a connection between Mark and the disappearances were proven, other names would come to light. Big names. Names that shouldn't be mentioned. People who specialize in covering their tracks, in buying silence, in controlling narratives. And here comes the most perverse part of this story. The network was not made up of just people. It was made up of decisions, of pacts, of chain omissions. People who chose to turn a blind eye. prosecutors who forgot to attach evidence, detectives who lost recordings, journalists who changed their story from one day to the next, witnesses who gave up testifying and then disappeared from public life like someone walking away from the edge of a cliff. Can you see the impact? The depth of this manipulation? What is at stake is not just a crime. It is the way the truth is shaped by those who have the power to hide it. It is the way justice is corrupted before it is even born. And the cruelest part is that Mark knew this, and he accepted the role of villain, because deep down he knew that the real horror was outside the cell, unleashed, untouchable. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because when we follow Joseph H. Carter's trail, something strange appears. Records show that in 1998, a man who looked very similar to him reappeared with a new name, new CPF, new passport, new life. He introduced himself as a financial consultant and started working for an organization called Fundação Escudo. No one knows exactly what this foundation did, but it was linked through documents to offshore companies in 3 different countries, and one of these companies bought the orphanage land after the fire. Coincidence? Mark didn't think so. That's why he wrote in another letter, "If they want to erase everything, they have to erase me too. But I took with me the name they don't want anyone to find out." That name was never revealed, but it was hidden between the lines of every clue. In every silence the court forced, in every question that could never be asked. It's as if the story had been mangled, and the part that remained was the easiest to swallow, the most convenient, the weakest. Mark, the monster, the end. But the truth isn't like that. The truth is dirty, jagged, incomplete. And when you try to cover a body with a false story, there's always a leg sticking out, an arm dangling, a vestige that refuses to die. And if Mark knew so much, why did he never tell? Why did he hide names and codes? Why did he leave clues instead of outright accusations? The answer may not lie in courage, but in fear. Fear that if he said too much, someone he still protected would be swallowed up with him. Someone innocent, or maybe someone who was part of it but regretted it. Because not all monsters are born monsters. Some are shaped by dirty hands, others try to get out but are trapped in a cycle that does not forgive defections. This story doesn't end there. In fact, it didn't even begin. Because what's behind, it all still pulses in the dark. It still breathes where no one is looking. It still moves the pieces of a game much bigger than Mark, than Carter, than justice itself. Comment there. That makes sense to me. But how could he change his name if he never left there? That sentence kept circling around in the investigators' heads like a fly in a closed room. Something off kilter, subtle but present, like a muffled voice behind the wall. And the more they poked around, the more they realized that Joseph H. Carter's records stopped in 1994. Everything before that? Sure. Everything after? Absolute silence. No bank account, no new address, no social security number, no official death. Just a strategic absence. But then, a disturbing and almost imperceptible detail emerges. A disused psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of Fairview, where an unidentified patient used only a sequence of digits as his signature. And inside the medical record, a scribble. He never left there. He just changed his name. It was the same pattern as the encrypted letter. The doctor who signed the report died in a fire the following year. The building was demolished, and what was left of the documentation mysteriously disappeared during an internal audit. No fuss, no headlines, just a cold, clinical, planned disappearance. As if something, or someone, was cleaning up the loose ends, one by one. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject. Why did the judge block questions? What was the point in silencing names mentioned under oath? When Mark tried to hand over a list of 3 people he said knew too much, the paper was taken away before it reached the defense. They claimed protocol, and the 3 names, dead within 4 months of each other. 2 from natural causes. The 3rd disappeared on the highway between Phoenix and Nevada. never seen again. The car was found with the engine still warm, the radio tuned to a static station, and a single folded note in the glove compartment. "You don't understand. They never leave." That phrase popped up again 2 years later. On a private forum about unsolved disappearances, an anonymous user shared screenshots of veiled threatening emails signed simply JHC. And in one of the messages, the same coded quote was present. When they tried to trace the IP, it pointed to a server that had been inactive since 2003. None of this was revealed at the trial. Mark tried to tell him, but each attempt was muffled, each detail more disconcerting than the last. Even his own lawyer advised him to remain silent. And here comes a curious detail. The same lawyer had worked, years before, on another obscure case involving the disappearance of a systems engineer linked to the U.S. cyber defense. Coincidence? With each layer revealed, the case stops looking like an isolated crime and starts to sound like an operation. A methodical cleaning of everything that could point to what was really happening behind those confessions, behind the bodies, behind Mark himself. And that's why this material needs to be seen while it's still available. Because with each passing day, pieces disappear, pages go offline, sources disappear. This video is more than a story. It's a window into something many don't want you to see. If you're here until now, it's because something inside you realizes that this truth is still alive, even if buried. So sign up now. That way you won't lose the thread when it starts to unravel with force, and stay until the end. Because what comes next is the breaking point, the revelation that changes everything. And the end. The end is what no one is prepared to see. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject. Mark wasn't just a convict on death row. He was an open wound. And someone somewhere along the way decided that that wound needed to be silenced, not healed. What came to light after his execution was not just an echo of what he said, but the muffled cry of what he could never reveal. While in the federal prison's psychiatric ward, Mark attended monitored sessions with a criminal psychologist, assigned by the prison system itself. Routine sessions, recorded, archived. But one session, just one, was missing from the records. It was sealed by court order, an embargo that, at the time, no one could explain. Not even the psychologist in charge was able to comment on its content. And for years, this recording was treated as a legend among employees, agents, and even lawyers who walked through that cold hallway. Then, in 2017, a retired former employee leaked part of the audio on an obscure network, an encrypted forum accessed by less than 500 people worldwide. A file of just over 36 minutes, but enough to dismantle the whole thing. On the tape, Mark is not handcuffed, nor is he altered. He seems calm at first, but with a lost look in his eyes. He speaks as if he doesn't know if he's really being heard, or if it's just another simulation. His voice is choked up. His sentences are spaced out. But then he says, "They promised they would protect me, but if I open my mouth, I will kill innocent people." The psychologist tries to keep the session under control, but the recording shows the exact moment Mark breaks down. His crying is not out of guilt or regret, it's out of exhaustion, like someone carrying a truth that's too heavy, like someone trapped by something no one would ever understand or believe. At one point, he starts drawing. You can hear the sound of graphite scratching the paper. After a few seconds of silence, he says, almost in a whisper, "It's all there, underground." The phrase is repeated 3 times throughout the tape, and each time with more weight, more desperation, as if he were trying to make it clear, with the words he could, that there was something hidden beneath the structure where he was kept. There. Where? The prison? The psychiatric hospital? The deactivated building mentioned in the records from the 90s? The file ends abruptly. There are no more recorded sessions with Mark after this one, and the psychologist involved disappeared from the system 2 months later. Request for voluntary resignation. No interviews, no contact with the press, and he was never seen in public again. But there's something even more disturbing. Mark's final psychiatric report has been edited. The original notes have been replaced with a contrived, shallow, protocol-like clinical summary. The writing style doesn't match any of the previous reports, and the signature at the bottom, a poorly done scan of a name that had already retired. This wasn't a mistake. It was a cleansing, a psychological burning of files. And if you think that's an exaggeration, listen to this. A year after the tape was leaked, another inmate at the same penitentiary wrote a handwritten letter saying that what Mark knew was buried beneath the old infirmary. Detail: the infirmary was renovated after a structural accident that was never explained. The inmate who wrote the letter died 2 days later. Internal bleeding from a perforated intestine. Official version: a fight between inmates. But the security camera in his cell was turned off that morning. Coincidence? Not for someone who has been investigating cases like this for years. This is the classic trail of something that needs to disappear without a trace, without making any noise. And here is the question that won't go away. What was underground? Some forums point to psychiatric containment labs used in secret programs during the Cold War. Others speak of experiments involving extreme isolation, sensory deprivation, and drug-induced mental simulations, tests that would never be approved in the light of day. Conspiracy theory? Maybe. But the history of the region, the unexplained renovations, the missing documents, they all point to something carefully hidden, something that perhaps began as an attempt at control and ended up spiraling out of control. Mark wasn't trying to get rid of the guilt. He wanted to warn, but no one heard in time. Or maybe someone heard and decided to bury it deeper. Comment here. That makes sense to me. I want to know who is really seeing beyond the obvious. Beneath the orphanage's floorboards, rotten wood, hollow creaks, the smell of old damp, there was more than dust and oblivion. In 2021, an excavation by an independent group of former employees of the city's former social administration found a trapdoor, hidden under the carpet of a room that for decades had been used as a children's cafeteria, a place where children ate with a smile. Unknowingly, the access to the trapdoor was sealed with chains and a rusty padlock. The wood around it showed signs that someone had, at some point, tried to break the entrance open by force. But they stopped, or were prevented from doing so. When they opened it, the smell was the first thing that came out. Something between old meat and overburned candles. A scent that lingers in the memory, as if death had been trapped down there waiting to be remembered. The stairs led to an unventilated room, 4x4, damp walls painted black, and in the center, a cross, handmade, not of wood, nor of iron, but of something that makes your skin crawl just to describe it. Human threads, intertwined, sewn together as if someone had spent hours, perhaps days, braiding hair of different thicknesses and colors, until it gave shape to that macabre symbol. Around the cross, there were burn marks on the ground, small iron cages with distorted bars as if some force had pushed them from the inside out. Inside some, fragments of fingernails. Others had scratch marks on the inside. One of the investigators fell ill. Another resigned a few days later and disappeared from the press, as if he wanted to erase his name from everything he had seen. In the far corner, piled against the wall, were the remains. Fragments of children's bones, too small to be mistaken for any animal. Ashes were collected in boxes inscribed in Latin and broken religious icons, decapitated saints, broken crucifixes, eyes ripped from statues. It was as if faith had been used as bait or punishment. The images were recorded, in silence, by the camera of one of the excavators, but nothing was officially released. No portal, no headline. The police report concluded that it was remains of an old basement with an unknown purpose. The church that ran the orphanage remained silent. The local government denied any involvement, and the media hushed it up, intentionally or out of fear. Maybe both. But a week later, the images began to leak. First on obscure forums, then on closed groups. Finally, they reached Reddit. The photos did not look like they were staged, and what caught users' attention most was not the cross or the bones, but what was written in charcoal on the wall in the background. "They still scream at night." The phrase went viral. Some said it was fake. Others claimed it was a macabre art performance. But there was one detail that few noticed. In the bottom corner of one of the photos, partially obscured by shadow, there was a name: Mark. The same signature that appeared on the diary seized at the 1994 trial. The handwriting was the same, shaky, slanted to the side, as if it had been written in a hurry or out of fear. This detail became an obsession for those who had been following the case for years. Could it be possible that Mark had returned to the place? Or had he never left completely? Doubts gripped the groups that followed the story. Some independent investigators began to put together a timeline, cross-referencing dates, times, and names of former orphanage employees with forgotten police records. That's how they found a name that almost no one remembered: Edgar Morels. He was a cleaner at the place during the 80s and 90s. He had disappeared months before the first report. At the time, they said he had moved. But a disturbing detail emerged. The last record of Edgar's presence was on a specific night, the same night that 3 children disappeared without a trace. They were never found. No bodies, no clothes. Just a notebook scribbled with drawings of a staircase going down and a phrase written several times: "Beneath the light, the truth dies." The notebook was ignored at the time, filed as product with no investigative value. But it reappeared in 2022 at an auction of forgotten police memorabilia, bought by an anonymous collector, and once again shared on forums. The pages were stained but legible, and in one of the drawings there was something no one expected to see: Mark's face, or rather, something that looked like him. Disfigured, with empty eyes and a scar that he would only have years after his arrest. How would anyone have drawn that before? This revelation opened a new layer, a new possibility. What if Mark was not just a product of pain, but of something bigger? Something that was there before he was born? Something that used people as instruments? The question that began to echo among the most skeptical was no longer whether he was guilty, but what exactly shaped him. Because looking closely, the patterns repeat themselves: isolated places, silence, authorities who disappear with evidence, and a cycle that seems not to want to be broken. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject. Because when they followed the tracks from the basement to old maintenance records of the building, they discovered something that changes everything you think about what happened there. Write in the comments. This makes sense to me. Mark wasn't stupid. He knew that something much bigger was moving behind the scenes in that forgotten city. He could smell the rot in the air before he even went down to that basement. But what he saw down there, that wasn't just crime. It was worship, ritual. It was surrender. The cross made of human hair still pulsates in the memory of those who saw it. It was not a symbol. It was a warning. A silent signature of a group that hid not only out of fear, but out of conviction, because they believed in something ancient, something that has no name but that demands blood. The detail that went unnoticed by many was the arrangement of those broken icons around the cross. They were not thrown. They were placed with precision, a pattern, a coded message that, according to a former forensic expert, referred to an ancient code of order and sacrifice used by an organization that dissolved after World War II. And then a detail emerged, one that few were ready to see: the presence of a symbol carved into the floor of the trapdoor. Small, almost faded, but visible. A triangle with a circle in the center. In files declassified years earlier, this same symbol had appeared in secret surveillance reports about a brotherhood formed by former American military personnel who had taken refuge in small towns in South America during the 1970s. The connection seemed absurd, until someone remembered one of the names mentioned in those reports: Padre Dominic Austerlitz, expelled from the church in 1974 for practices incompatible with the gospel. Where did this priest end up after his expulsion? His final address, on record, an abandoned orphanage on the New Mexico-Arizona border. The same orphanage where Mark grew up. And that's where the pact theory fits in with surgical precision. Several of the inmates of that orphanage disappeared from public records between 1991 and 1996. No adoptions, no deaths, no escapes. They were simply gone, as if they'd never existed. Except Mark knew. He saw what was happening, and he tried to warn. In hidden notes, in newspaper clippings tucked between the loose floorboards of his old room, he collected pieces of the truth, waiting for the right moment to put the puzzle together. But too much truth is expensive. He began receiving anonymous messages on his cell phone, codes, dates, coordinates, always the same warning. You are breaking the pact. First came the subtle warnings, then came the explicit threats, and finally, the first death. One of his childhood friends, who shared with him the forbidden memories of the orphanage, was found drowned in the city reservoir. The autopsy indicated marks on his wrists, not from a struggle, from being tied up. But the official report claimed accidental drowning while consuming alcohol. Mark got the message, but he didn't back down, because he knew something that none of them could erase: the real name of one of the founders of the sect. A name that was linked to powerful companies, local politicians, and, most importantly, to the institution that financed the orphanage during its darkest years, the Foundation Future Gods. The facade seemed philanthropic. It cared for children, offered scholarships, promoted spiritual reconnection. But behind the surface, there was something more. A network of psychic experiments on minors, funded by hidden contracts with military technology companies. Mark discovered this when he hacked into the digital files of one of the expelled members. He recorded everything, documented it, exposed it, and paid the price. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject. Why did this sect need absolute silence? Because the pact was not just between people, it was between worlds. An agreement sealed in blood, between what can be seen and what lives behind the curtain. The members were not just accomplices in crimes. They believed they were protecting something, maintaining balance, preventing the awakening of a force that, according to their internal texts, corrodes the mind of those who try to name it. The most disturbing thing is that in one of the recordings found by Mark, a hooded man says the following sentence: "He woke up once and almost took everything with him." The voice is low, precise, and accompanied by noises that do not seem human. Some audio experts tried to isolate the background sounds. The result was something that no one could explain. Sounds of metal dragging, heartbeats, and in the background, what sounds like a child crying. But backwards, none of this was aired. The media didn't want to cover it. The authorities claimed it was malicious fraud. But the files exist. They are scattered, fragmented across forums, stored on anonymous drives protected by passwords that only those who have gone through the same pain understand. And that is the detail that unites all the pieces. Pain. They chose the broken, the orphans, the ones no one would hear, because they knew that silence was guaranteed until Mark broke the rule. He never revealed everything. He didn't have time. But one last letter was found sewn inside the coat he was wearing when he disappeared. A handwritten sentence in his own handwriting. "They hide among those who claim to save us. There is no date. There is no signature. That's all." A silent accusation that echoes to this day among the few who dare to investigate. And if all this is really true, what is this sect trying so hard to keep locked up? Comment below. This makes sense to me if you also feel that something big has been covered up for decades. But no one realized this in time. At first, Mark's notes seemed like the scribbles of a schizophrenic delirium. Loose sentences, ancient symbols, disjointed names. One psychiatrist even described it as a rare clinical case of constructive paranoia. But then the intersections began. Dates that matched records of disappearances. Names that were discreetly linked to front institutions used for money laundering and human trafficking. Places where years later they found signs of rituals, marks on the ground, buried objects that had no logical explanation. And the most disturbing thing, Mark not only mentioned these locations before any official body identified them, he left little warnings about what would happen there. He didn't make the mistake of shouting the truth. He whispered it. Each note was a hidden sentence, a warning to anyone who had the courage to decipher it. But no one did, because the human mind has an almost automatic reflex. It rejects the absurd to preserve what it still understands as real. And that's what happened. Mark has become the perfect monster for public opinion. Psychotic, obsessed, a classic manipulator. But what they called obsession was actually a pattern of defense, a crooked but precise way of exposing what no one wanted to touch. In one of the last letters he wrote, hidden in the false bottom of a worn Bible, found by chance in the sealed apartment, there was a sentence that, if it had been read at the right time, might have prevented 2 confirmed deaths. Maybe more. The truth does not hide. It disguises itself. This sentence, so simple, almost generic, hides a brutal reasoning. Mark was not inventing. He was deciphering codes that were already before everyone's eyes. But deciphering has a price, and he paid. He was labeled, ignored, ridiculed. But every time they tried to bury his story deeper, a new detail emerged, a name mentioned in a behind-the-scenes conversation that came to light in a confidential process, a location he mentioned, and which later appeared to be linked to an international influence peddling operation. It was no coincidence. It was invisible coherence. The narrative that seemed like delusions was slowly fitting into a precise timeline. Details that, taken separately, seemed harmless. But together, they formed a puzzle that no one wanted to put together, and when they started to assemble, it was already late. The truth does not redeem the dead, but sometimes it drags the living along. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because the most disturbing part came when they crossed schedules. Yes, schedules. A behavior analyst noticed that Mark always wrote the codes, those loose, seemingly unconnected sentences between 2:47 and 3:13 in the morning. Every day. It wasn't insomnia. He called this time the echo window. The investigation tried to link this to a sleep disorder, but nothing matched. That's when they cross-referenced the prison records. Between those hours, security cameras were out of order. Not because of a power outage, but because internal magnetic interference, and this happened in 2 different prisons, in different states, in different years, always at the same time. This pattern was not disclosed. The official reason was technical failure. But the technical record said something else. The interference was coming from within. That is, something or somebody activated a kind of blocking field inside the cell. And then comes the craziest part. During these periods, Mark's heart rate increased by 140% for no apparent reason. He was awake, but he didn't move. He didn't speak. He just wrote. It was like I was channeling, words that didn't come from him, phrases like, "They already know that I know," or "The traitor is at the table on the left," phrases that were later associated with real places, people, and events. But this kind of revelation doesn't go with madness, matches with access. What if Mark, instead of being delusional, was accessing something no one else could? Something that connected distorted religion, a failing military, and dirty money. Little by little, the layers of the Mark case stopped being a mystery and became a mirror. A dirty, shattered mirror where each fragment showed something different, but they all belonged to the same frame. The question was no longer, what did he hide? The question was, what was he unable to hide in time? And maybe the answer lies in the videos. Yes, videos, 3 files found on an encrypted server, named with a seemingly meaningless name, Quarterface. These videos have never been shown publicly, but one of the experts who had access described them as follows. What you have there is not evidence, it is a sentence. Comment there. That makes sense to me. Now hold on to that feeling, because there's a piece that hasn't fit together yet. And the way it comes out is nothing like what you expect. The letter arrived with no return address, no stamp, no fingerprint. An ordinary envelope, but it smelled of old dust and rusty metal, as if it had been buried for years. The retired agent, who had long avoided any contact with the past, almost threw it away without opening it. But something about the crooked handwriting on the corner of the envelope, almost a visual whisper, made his hand tremble. He tore the paper carefully, and then he saw it. The photo, faded, grainy, but unmistakable. It was him, the chaplain who had disappeared in 1983. Only, now, he was alive, older, thinner, but with the same look in his eyes, the same look that had stared at the psychiatrists without blinking, as if he knew something that no one there would ever understand. On the back of the photo, a handwritten phrase, black ink, strong pressure on the paper, almost tearing the surface. Did you think it was over? The agent's stomach turned, because he knew. This wasn't just a provocation, it was a summons. An echo of something he had tried to bury along with the reports, the testimonies and the memories that had destroyed his personal life. That case wasn't over. It never ended. It had just been quiet, waiting for the right time to resurface. And now it was back with a vengeance. He ran down to the basement. He grabbed an old box, 3 padlocks, a chain, a code written upside down. The box had been sealed since 1991. Inside, a tape, VHS. File 17, do not review. But he did, and what he saw didn't make sense, because the video showed the chaplain being taken, not killed, not executed, but transferred, to a place not on any official map, a facility with no name, an endless hallway, and in the background, the sound, a voice, someone muttering a prayer he'd heard before, in his cell. The dates started to match up. The sightings in abandoned mental hospitals, the noises picked up on shortwave radios, the children disappearing in similar patterns, as if it were all a cycle, as if it had come back and was recreating the ritual. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the face, because in 1994 an entire family disappeared in Vermont. All that was left was a single photo, taken by a sound-activated baby monitor, and in the background, in the mirror, the same face, the same look, expressionless, as if watching from afar, but always there. The truth is that this case was never about a single crime. It was about a pattern, a cycle, a type of intelligence that operates outside of ordinary time, outside of logic, that feeds on traumas, unresolved decisions, prolonged silences. That always comes back, and always comes back differently, but always comes back with a purpose. That letter was just the first call. In the months that followed, 6 more retired agents reported receiving the same envelope, different photos, same handwriting, cryptic phrases, precise locations, some of them matching coordinates that had been locked away in government files for decades, places where no one was supposed to dig, where maps stopped, where stories were erased before they could make headlines. One of those coordinates led to a forest in Michigan. There they found an underground building that looked like an upside-down church. It had upside-down pews, burnt religious icons, and an inscription on the walls written in dozens of dead languages. They watch in silence, they decide who sees. Inside the building there were files, documents with the names of people who had been reported missing, but who no one had ever really looked for, as if they were social shadows, people who would have no impact if they disappeared. But on all the files, there was a signature, the same name as the chaplain, with dates that exceeded his own life expectancy. The question that began to arise was even more uncomfortable. What if he had never been an ordinary man? What if he was just a representation, a vehicle, a kind of point of contact between something larger and much older than any doctrine. This prompted a task force to be reactivated, secretly, without official authorization. People who had lost family members in similar circumstances began to gather in closed forums. Stories that had previously seemed like delusions began to fit together with surgical precision. A hidden truth emerged from the noise of the old internet, from the darkest corners of archived files, as if the very structure of the case was slowly being revealed by someone or something who wanted to be discovered. The agent's mindset changed. He stopped looking for logical explanations. He began to understand that certain mysteries don't demand answers, they demand acceptance. And in the process, he realized that there was a logic there, a logic of its own, perverse, but structured. Every victim, every clue, every silence had a purpose, an impact, an unspoken message. It was then that he found the final note, tucked inside an old book about forbidden exorcisms. The note simply said, "When the pattern is complete, the beginning returns," and with it, a number, 3 digits, which, coincidentally, or not, was the code to the cell where the chaplain had been held before he disappeared. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because when this pattern was finally drawn out completely, something beyond the physical clues began to emerge. A kind of presence, invisible but dense, that seemed to watch anyone who got too close. A pattern of behavior that began to repeat itself not only in the victims, but also in the investigators. Comment: I'm on this journey too. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this story held you back. It wasn't just curiosity. It was the feeling that certain truths do not die. They just hide, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. And if at any point on this journey you felt this, if between the pauses, the silences, and the hidden whispers, something inside you moved, then maybe you are not here by chance. This space is not just a channel. It is a shelter for those who carry too many questions and too few answers. For those who feel that there is something wrong in the world and can no longer ignore it. If this connection hit hard, if you felt there was more beneath the surface than he is, here, whoever enters doesn't come back the same, because every time a secret finds someone who is ready to listen, he transforms indeed in liberation, in fury. Like this video if it made sense to you. It's not about numbers. It's about keeping a space alive where stories like this do not be forgotten. And if you made it to the end, comment, "I'm with you until the end." This phrase is not a catchphrase. It is a silent pact between those who don't look away. There's a video here on the side. It not only complements what you just saw, he poke, reopens a wound, and it delivers a detail that changes everything. Click and follow me. Why what comes now is even more disturbing.